Welcome to Minnesota Votes 2010, a continuing series dedicated to looking at Minnesota's elections.
When I began to think about running for Attorney General, I started to investigate the nature of the office. What I discovered was troubling, that in fact the Minnesota Attorney General's office has been controlled by one-party machine for 40 continuous years. I knew from studying government that when that happens, there will be misconduct and scandals in that office. And I soon discovered that the Minnesota Attorney General's office has a recent history of serious misconduct and scandals. The I-Team of WCCO-TV News became interested in the story, and they went and they actually tried to film an interview with incumbent Lori Swanson and ask her these important questions. Incumbent Swanson refused to answer.
The WCCO I-Team first told you about expensive soundproof doors in a top state leader's office. Now there are allegations of unethical and unlawful behavior.
When Pat Kessler started asking questions, Attorney General Lori Swanson issued a press release but refused to sit down for an interview. She's fighting back today because a state watchdog just reopened an investigation into her office. In sworn testimony, lawyers are accusing Swanson of putting them on cases for her own political gain, and they haven't spoken out until now.
It was always political mode, yes.
Paul Civello was a Medicaid fraud attorney under both Attorneys General Mike Hatch and Lori Swanson. He says employees were pressured into working on high-profile cases intended only to bring publicity and political attention to the boss. But there's more to his charges than just politics.
The problem I found in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit was an attempt to deceive the Office of Inspector General.
Civello makes the claims in a sworn affidavit in which he describes misconduct by two successive Democratic attorneys general, the top law enforcement officers in the state. One case in particular, he says, a lawyer was hired under a different title in order to receive federal funding. Another attorney who still works in the AG's office writes in a memo that this amounted to fraud.
There has been, over the years, while I was there, a pattern of filing lawsuits, holding a press conference, and then quietly either settling the case or dumping the case.
But that's not what bothers Civello the most. He says Swanson deceived the federal government, using the Medicaid Fraud Unit to prosecute cases that helped her campaign for Attorney General. The auditor is now taking a second look, expanding his investigation to cover a longer period of time.
Because certainly if there are misrepresentations, we want to uncover that.
Since Swanson took office, 68 attorneys have left their jobs with that office. That's about half the total number of attorneys working there.
This kind of misconduct really should not surprise us. When an office, an important government office, is held by one party for 40 continuous years, we should expect to see scandals, misconduct, and some of that misconduct can be so damaging that it can injure our entire state. And that's what's happened in this case. For many years, we had a law in Minnesota that was just changed last year. It was finally closed. For you see, we had a slush fund for the Attorney General's office. With this law, the Attorney General could settle cases and then give the money received from these cases to anyone the Attorney General wanted to. Now, in most states, you would assume that when the Attorney General settles a lawsuit, the money goes to the taxpayers. The money should go to pay for the legal work. The money should go to the victims of whatever the lawsuit was about. But in Minnesota, we had a slush fund, and the limit of the slush fund was $750,000. So what happened was incumbent Attorney General Swanson, then the Solicitor General, settled a lawsuit for $749,999, just $1 under this limit, so it came into the slush fund rule. And then what she did was she signed a settlement document that gave $250,000, $249,999 of our taxpayer money to Acorn. This is extraordinary. This is the infamous Capital One settlement. And what I did was I actually went and got the original documents, because people were assuming that Attorney General Swanson wasn't involved in that, and I didn't know why they would think that, since she was now endorsed and had an A+ rating from Acorn. It seemed to me reasonable that there was a link and a connection there. So I went and got the original document, and as you can see from the original document, not only do we see the transfer of $250,000 taxpayer dollars to Acorn, but we also see that the only official, the only person for the state of Minnesota who signed this document and transferred all of that money from the taxpayers to Acorn was Lori Swanson, who's our current incumbent Attorney General. I'm sure that's as troubling to you as it was to me when I discovered that. Even more troubling is the fact that she's never had to answer why she did that, or where that money went, or who accepted that money, or how that money was used. This is especially important given that Acorn is famous for taking money from various sources and using it to get Democratic candidates elected. This would be highly illegal if this money were used in this manner. And yet the actual use of this money has never been investigated. And she's never had to answer a single question about where that money went. It's time now for that investigation to take place. It's time for the Attorney General to come forth and explain to the people of Minnesota why she gave $250,000 of our dollars to one of the most notorious organizations in the United States. I'm not the only one that noticed that the current Attorney General of our state, Lori Swanson, transferred $250,000 taxpayer dollars to Acorn. Members of the legislature called for an investigation, but they were refused. They've never held hearings, and Attorney General Swanson has never had to testify as to why she did this, why she transferred the money, or where the money went. The legislative auditor, James Noble, looked into this, and he wrote a letter that summarizes what he found. The Office of the Legislative Auditor has received allegations concerning the consent judgment that resulted from a complaint filed by Attorney General Mike Hatch against Capital One. The judgment was signed by you, this is to Lori Swanson, as Solicitor General, and filed with the Ramsey County District Court on February 13th, 2006. It provided for the distribution of money to the Legal Aid Society, $250,000, the Minnesota Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, ACORN, $249,999, and the state of Minnesota received the rest. The question was, why did they settle this for the $749,999, $1 under the AG slush fund limit? Was any of that money used for campaign purposes? Because you see, after the money cleared and the check was cashed, Acorn apparently endorsed and helped Lori Swanson run for Attorney General. If any of that taxpayer money was used for campaign purposes, it would be a serious criminal matter, and the FBI and other agencies should become involved. So during his investigation, the legislative auditor asked both incumbent Lori Swanson and former Attorney General Mike Hatch to come and to testify about why they had done this, why they had transferred the money, where the money went, and how it was used. They both refused to testify. And to this day, they have still never given a statement as to why this money was transferred. Now, after 40 years of continuous control by a political machine, we would expect there to be other forms of misconduct and scandal in the office of Attorney General. And in fact, when we investigate it, we find out that that is in fact the case. There are a number of lawyers who have worked in that office. These are lawyers that were hired by the Attorney General's office. These are attorneys who are licensed in the state of Minnesota. These are lawyers who have the responsibility to be assistant attorney generals of the state of Minnesota. The Office of the Legislative Auditor documented by sworn statements given under oath from seven lawyers that work in the office that in fact there was unethical and illegal activity in Lori Swanson's Attorney General's office. This information from the Legislative Auditor documents a number of troubling things that have gone wrong in that office. So, for example, his letter notes, quote, specifically, Representative Simon said it had been alleged that some attorneys in the Attorney General's office felt pressured to, 1, sign and issue a civil investigative demand without sufficient merit, 2, insert unsubstantiated information in an affidavit, 3, give advice that was not in the best interest of a client, 4, find defendants to help the Attorney General's office bring certain types of lawsuits, and 5, post comments favorable to the office and Attorney General Swanson on an internet blog and record the time used for blogging as annual leave time even though state time was used. It's time for us to ask, what is Lori Swanson hiding? Why is our incumbent Attorney General refusing to answer simple questions about why she transferred $250,000 taxpayer dollars into the pockets of Acorn? Why is she hiding as to where that money went? Why won't she answer questions as to why 7 of her own lawyers, licensed attorneys in the state of Minnesota, have accused her of unethical or illegal misconduct? Why won't she just answer the questions? It's time to come clean with the people of Minnesota. It's time for the person who's supposed to be our lawyer to come clean and let us know why she did these things. One of the most serious problems with the election of 2008 is that felons voted illegally. We also have reason to believe that through the vouching law, a very strange law that Minnesota has that permits a large number of people to vote with no form of identification whatsoever. And I began to think back to law school when I knew some people who believed in a philosophy of a community organization called Acorn. And 2 of Acorn's main tenets are that felons should vote and illegal immigrants should be able to vote. And I began to wonder if there was a connection of Acorn to the Minnesota troubles in our election system. So what was the link between Acorn and the current incumbent Attorney General Lori Swanson? I was soon to discover that it's a much more profound link than most of us realize. To have the very person most responsible for protecting the integrity of elections being endorsed and supported by a national organization that's well known for manipulating elections illegally, an organization that has been prosecuted throughout the United States. The Acorn-tainted elections of 2008 have badly damaged the reputation of our state, and they sent Mr. Franken to Washington to become the 60th vote for the federal health care takeover legislation, which is now a burden to our nation. It is time for us to reform our election system so that this kind of damage does not happen in the future.
Vote for Chris Barden.